Hi, I'm Hilarie Hicks, and I'm here to answer the question. It's the 4th of July. Where are you, James Madison? At Montpelier, we've traditionally saved our big celebrations for Constitution Day. Madison is front and center on Constitution Day, but he doesn't usually get as much attention when it comes to Independence Day. But many of our visitors are curious about what Madison did during the American Revolution. They know that George Washington commanded the Continental Army. They know that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. So what did James Madison do? In this presentation, I'll talk first about what Madison did in the Revolution, and particularly where he was and what he was doing in the time leading up to July 4th, 1776. But 1776 was only one of many July 4ths for James Madison. It remained an important anniversary throughout his lifetime. So we'll take a look at some other memorable Independence Days in Madison's life too. What did he do to celebrate? What thoughts were on his mind in different years about the meaning of independence? And what other events transpired on the 4th of July that gave the anniversary a different meaning for James Madison? But first, let's start where it all began in 1776. When Madison was in Williamsburg. In 1776, James Madison was young, only 25 years old. I'm actually cheating a little bit with this 1783 image of Madison, but it's the earliest one that's been identified. And if you think he looks young here, try to imagine him 7 years younger in 1776. So by contrast, Thomas Jefferson was 33 that year, and George Washington was 44. Madison had come home from Princeton in 1772. He had completed the usual 3-year course of study in 2 years, which had worn down his health. And he stayed on in Princeton a few months studying law and the Hebrew language. Once home, he continued studying law without much enthusiasm. Then, as Madison later wrote in a third-person autobiographical sketch, quote, "On the commencement of the dispute with Great Britain, he entered with the prevailing zeal into the American cause, being under very early and strong impressions in favor of liberty, both civil and religious," unquote. He tried joining a militia company, but found that he didn't have the physical stamina to participate in the military drills. He turned to the political side of the revolution instead. First, he was elected to Orange County's Committee of Safety in December 1774. And despite the name sounding like it was trying to prevent workplace accidents, the committees of safety were a sort of de facto local government, as the local government structures established by Great Britain were no longer universally recognized by the Americans. Then in the spring of 1776, the citizens of Orange County elected Madison to represent them in the 5th Virginia Convention, meeting at the Capitol in Williamsburg. Like the committees of safety, the Virginia conventions were extra-legal, outside the system of British colonial government. So for a little background, the First Virginia Convention was held in Williamsburg in 1774. It came about because the British governor of the colony of Virginia had dissolved the House of Burgesses, the lower house of Virginia's colonial government. And this happened after the British government had closed the port of Boston in retribution for the Boston Tea Party. The Virginia Burgesses voted to hold a day of prayer in support of Boston, and the governor dissolved them. The Burgesses, who were the elected representatives of the people, just moved on down the street to the Raleigh Tavern and continued to meet in an unofficial capacity. There were 3 more Virginia conventions in 1775. The 2nd and 3rd met in Richmond, and the 4th met in Williamsburg. But the really important one was the 5th Virginia Convention, and that's the one that James Madison was elected to. It was held in Williamsburg from May 6th to July 6th, 1776. And the 5th Virginia Convention took 3 momentous steps. The first was on May 15th. the convention directed Virginia's delegates to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to propose independence for all 13 colonies, stating these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. There's actually a little bit of overlap between the Virginia conventions and the House of Burgesses. The Burgesses had one more working session in June 1775. They tried to meet a few times after that, but had not been able to muster up a quorum. But on May 16th, the day after the Fifth Virginia Convention voted to propose independence, the Burgesses gave up. Their secretary recorded in their journal, several members met, but did neither proceed to business nor adjourn as a House of Burgesses. And as you can see here, their secretary declared finis with quite an exuberant flourish. Change was happening, and Madison was helping to make that change. And as to the other two momentous things that the Fifth Virginia Convention did, on June the 12th, it adopted George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. And in that autobiographical sketch that I mentioned, Madison wrote of himself that, quote, being young and in the midst of distinguished and experienced members of the convention, he did not enter into its debates, though he occasionally suggested amendments, the most material of which was a change in the terms in which the freedom of conscience was expressed in the proposed Declaration of Rights. George Mason's draft would have guaranteed, quote, fullest toleration in the exercise of religion. Now that implied that there would still be a government-established church. Madison successfully moved to change that to, quote, free exercise of religion, which does not imply a state-supported church. And then the third thing was on June the 29th, the convention adopted a constitution for the Commonwealth of Virginia with a Republican form of government. And that meant that Virginia now had its own state government established even before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Although the convention had directed Virginia's delegates to the Continental Congress to propose independence for all 13 colonies, the Virginians didn't know what was happening in Philadelphia in real time. So Madison went about his convention business on July 4th without knowing that the Declaration of Independence had been signed. That news didn't hit the Williamsburg newspaper until July 19th or 20th, after the convention was over. But just to show that great minds were thinking along the same lines, it was on July 5th, just before adjourning, that the Virginia Convention voted to delete all references to the British royal family in the prayers of the Anglican Church service. Virginians would no longer say, God save the King. This engraving of the Declaration, incidentally, is a commemorative edition printed by the newspaper publisher John Binns in 1820. It shows the Declaration encircled by medallions of the 13 original states, as well as portraits of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and John Hancock. We know that Madison ordered a copy of the Binns Declaration, and the Madisons' niece, Mary Cutts, recalled that it was hung conspicuously in the drawing room at Montpelier. Even if James Madison didn't fully experience July 4th, 1776 as a significant date while it was happening, it did usher in a new chapter in world history and in his own political career. He served a term in the Virginia House of Delegates, although he lost re-election in 1777 by failing to treat the visitors with food and liquor. From 1778 to 79, he served on the Virginia Council of State, where he worked closely with then Governor Thomas Jefferson. From 1780 to 83, he served as a delegate to the Continental Congress, now known as the Confederation Congress, since the 13 states had chosen to unite under the Articles of Confederation. And remember, the Revolutionary War was still ongoing at this time. The British surrendered at Yorktown in 1771, but the war didn't actually end until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. And it was in 1783, the year that this miniature was painted, that Madison was in Congress in Philadelphia and wrote to his father about a man he enslaved named Billy Gardner. Madison seemed to imply that Billy had tried to escape, and he apparently was mulling over several courses of action, including selling Billy, the Madison's usual punishment for escaped slaves, or sending Billy back to Montpelier. Madison finally decided to sell Billy in Philadelphia for a lower price, where the law prohibited long-term servitude. He wrote to his father on September 8th, 1783, "On a view of all circumstances, I have judged it most prudent not to force Billy back to Virginia, even if it could be done, and have accordingly taken measures for his final separation from me. I am persuaded his mind is too thoroughly tainted to be a fit companion for fellow slaves in Virginia. The laws here, Philadelphia, do not admit of his being sold for more than 7 years. I do not expect to get near the worth of him, but cannot think of punishing him for transportation, merely for coveting that liberty for which we have paid the price of so much blood and have proclaimed so often to be the right and worthy the pursuit of every human being." Madison apparently didn't consider freeing Billy outright, and he certainly wasn't on the verge of becoming an abolitionist. But his own experience had at any rate given him pause. He realized that he couldn't begrudge Billy for coveting that liberty, which we have proclaimed so often to be the right of every human being. Now let's look at the 4th of July during another momentous period in Madison's life. The summer of 1787 found Madison back in Philadelphia, this time with enslaved manservant John. Madison was at the Constitutional Convention, working on a new system of government to replace the ineffective Articles of Confederation. The convention opened on May 25th and lasted until mid-September. Madison's notes from the convention reveal that just before the July 4th holiday, the convention hit a significant impasse. On July 2nd, the delegates deadlocked over the question of how the number of each state's representatives in the upper house, the Senate, would be determined. The small states wanted each state to have an equal vote, which is how the Congress was set up under the Articles of Confederation. And the large states wanted representation to be proportional to each state's population, which would give the larger states more influence. And Madison himself favored proportional representation. On Monday, July the 2nd, 5 small states voted for equal representation. 5 large states voted against, and the 2 delegates from Georgia couldn't agree, so Georgia's vote was divided. Rhode Island didn't participate in the convention at all, and New Hampshire's delegates didn't arrive until late July. So the convention is basically deadlocked 5.5 to 5.5. How could anything move forward when the states were so hopelessly divided on this fundamental issue? According to Madison's notes, Roger Sherman said, "We are now at a full stop, and nobody," he supposed, meant that we should break up without doing something. General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney proposed referring the matter to a committee with delegates from all the states present. Madison himself thought that a committee was pointless, and that the compromise should just be worked out in the full convention. Elbridge Gerry, who was in favor of a committee, said, "Something must be done, or we shall disappoint not only America, but the whole world." The delegates voted to form a committee, And Madison's notes for the day conclude with the sentence that time might be given to the committee and to such as chose to attend to the celebrations on the anniversary of independence. The convention was adjourned till Thursday. That would be July 5th. The delegates wanted to celebrate independence, but they also knew that the American experiment in representative self-government was on the verge of failure if they couldn't agree on something better than the Articles of Confederation. There might not be anything to celebrate in the future if they couldn't come to an agreement in the present. That evening, July 2nd, the delegates met for dinner at the Indian Queen Hotel, perhaps a prelude to the holiday festivities to come. On the actual 4th of July, Madison may have gone to the Commons near the State House, where the city's militia and cavalry marched in parade formation and led the crowd to the old First Reformed Church several blocks away. Although the Constitutional Convention debated in secret, and the citizens of Philadelphia didn't know exactly where the process stood at the moment, they knew that something significant was underway. James Campbell, who delivered the oration at the church, urged the delegates to show that it was possible for a free people to govern themselves without a king, declaring, "How fallen would be our liberties if we discover inability to form a suitable government to preserve them." And Madison didn't attend the dinner hosted by the Society of the Cincinnati that evening, but one of their toasts reflected the same sentiment. The Grand Convention, may they form a constitution for an eternal republic. The delegates reconvened after Independence Day, and on July 16th adopted what we now think of as the Great Compromise. Each state would have equal representation in the Senate, 2 senators for every state, and proportional representation in the House, with a number of representatives based on population, the system we still have today. There were other issues that sparked debates and compromises throughout the summer, and finally, spoiler alert, the Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787. But that's a story for another day, Constitution Day. Today, we're just going to focus on the 4th of July, and that one particular 4th of July in 1787, when Madison and the other delegates may truly have wondered how much longer they would have a United States of America to celebrate. A lot hung in the balance in July of 1787, but fast forwarding to the new century, the American government had shown encouraging signs of stability, with peaceful transfers of presidential power from George Washington to John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. And Madison, as you probably know, served 2 terms as Jefferson's Secretary of State, and then 2 terms as the 4th president. For all but one of those years, Madison spent his 4th of July in Washington, D.C., and usually made a trip back to Montpelier later in the summer during the congressional recess. July 4th festivities during both Jefferson's and Madison's terms could include public dinners, speeches, cannons firing, parades of militia and regular army, and receptions at the president's house. Let's look at one celebration when Madison was Secretary of State and one while he was president. So here you see James and Dolly Madison as painted by Gilbert Stuart when Madison was Secretary of State. Using excerpts from several newspaper accounts, we can reconstruct the July 4th celebrations for 1808. The National Intelligencer reported, "In the morning, Captain Brent's troop of cavalry paraded before the house of Mr. Madison." The Monitor reported, "Mrs. Madison presented to the Corps of Volunteer Cavalry, commanded by Captain Brent on the 4th of July, a beautiful standard," essentially a flag for the Corps. The presentment was accompanied by an appropriate address from the fair donor, to which a suitable and gallant reply was made on behalf of the company. So as the wife of the Secretary of State, Dolly was already a public figure. The National Intelligencer continued. At noon, the apartments of the president were opened for the reception of a large concourse of ladies and gentlemen who partook of an abundant collation of refreshments and were enlivened by the excellent music of the Marine Corps. And the Universal Gazette reported, on the 4th of July, the heads of departments and the president's secretary were invited to a public dinner at Mr. Semm's Tavern by a number of the citizens of Georgetown, the Secretary of State, meaning Madison, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Attorney General, and Mr. Secretary Coles attended. At 4 o'clock, a very numerous and respectable company were seated at a table, most abundantly and elegantly served. Well, now we'll look at a capital fourth during Madison's presidency. The War of 1812 had been declared in June, and patriotism was on full display for the 4th of July a few weeks later. Although Congress usually went into recess in March or April, they remained in session until July 6th, and so they were still in Washington to attend ceremonial events. The National Intelligencer reported that an address was given at the Capitol by Richard Rush, who was then Comptroller of the Treasury and who would become Madison's Attorney General in 1814. Madison received an official escort to the Capitol for the event, along with his cabinet secretaries and his family, as the newspaper said. The newspaper didn't specify which family members attended, but the family could have included Dolly Madison, her son John Payne Todd, who had just finished at St. Mary's College in Baltimore in the spring of 1812, could have included Dolly's sister Anna Cutts, who was the wife of a congressman, and or Dolly's sister Lucy Todd, who was the wife of a Supreme Court justice. Madison and his entourage returned to the White House afterwards, where the National Intelligencer reported that, quote, an unusually numerous assemblage of ladies and gentlemen, including a large portion of the members of Congress, soon collected to offer and interchange their personal respects. Adding to the festivities were militia drills and a marching salute on the front lawn. Now, the only 4th of July during Madison's Washington years when he did not remain in the capital city was the final one of his presidency in 1816. As I mentioned earlier, Madison typically returned to Montpelier while Congress was in recess, leaving Washington sometime in mid-July and returning by mid-October. During the War of 1812, Madison's trips home were less regular and much shorter. In 1816, during his final year as president, Madison allowed himself a longer vacation, leaving the capital in early June. And since James and Dolly were home for the 4th of July for the first time in 16 years, they decided to throw a party. Not a backyard barbecue as we would think of it, but a very large outdoor dinner. And here's how Dolly Madison described the event in a letter to her sister Anna Cutts, which she wrote on July 5th. Yesterday, we had 90 persons to dine with us at one table, fixed on the lawn under a thick arbor. The dinner was profuse and handsome, and the company very orderly. Many of your old acquaintances, among them the 2 barbers. We had no ladies except Mother Madison, Mrs. Macon, and Nellie Willis. The day was cool and all quite pleasant. Half a dozen only stayed all night, and now are about to depart. But I am less worried here with 100 visitors than with 25 in Washington, this summer especially. The fact that only half a dozen people stayed overnight out of the 90 people at the dinner indicates that most of the guests were from Orange or somewhere nearby. When Richard Rush visited Montpelier later that summer or in the early fall, he must have heard about the Independence Day dinner because he wrote to a mutual friend that Madison, quote, lives with profuse hospitality, and in a way to strike the eye far more agreeably than while keeping tavern here, meaning in Washington. On the 4th of July, I was told 90 persons dined with him. To be sure, it was a special occasion, but not a week, scarcely a day, passes that he is not doing hospitality in a large way. In the early 20th century, when Gaillard Hunt wrote a biography of Madison, he included an anecdote shared with him by an elderly cousin of the Madisons about a lavish outdoor dinner at Montpelier. And Hunt wrote, "The personal impressions of Madison, taken down from the lips of his cousin, Miss Sarah Conway of Smithfield, Virginia, when 89 years of age and still in the full possession of her faculties, may be put down here. She often visited Montpelier as a girl, from 12 to 15 years of age." Madison was a very liberal man, and after his retirement from public life on one occasion, invited every family in Orange County to an entertainment, and the grounds were covered with tables to accommodate the people, the more distinguished guests and elderly people being entertained in the house. Although Miss Conway recalled this dinner being given after Madison's retirement, I think it was quite possible that she was referring to the outdoor dinner given to 90 people in 1816. She would have only been 6 or 7 years old at the time, so that was before she regularly visited at ages 12 to 15. Some biographies and secondary sources have described the Madisons' 4th of July barbecues as if they were an annual event, but that was probably due to the fact that there is a second copy of Dolly's letter that was misdated, leading to the impression that there was a dinner in 1820 also. Richard Rush is clearly talking about the 1816 dinner that Dolly wrote about, and he said, "To be sure, it was a special occasion." And what Miss Conway described to Hunt also seems to have been a one-time memorable event. She begins the story with "on one occasion," which is why I suspect she's recollecting the same dinner and is just off by a year. And as we'll see, we can document Madison being otherwise occupied on some 4th of July during his retirement. In addition to looking at what Madison did on different 4ths of July, I want to also capture some of his thoughts about independence, not all of which came to him on the actual anniversary date. So let's look at an exchange of letters between John Adams and James Madison in the summer of 1818. Madison did not have as close a personal friendship with Adams as he did with Jefferson, but they did correspond with each other from time to time. In late July 1818, Adams sent Madison a copy of a colonial-era sermon and then posed an interesting question. "There is a strange and invidious and pernicious question agitated in the public. Who was the author, the discoverer, the inventor of American independence? We might as well inquire who were the inventors of agriculture, horticulture, architecture, music. I cannot speak for Virginia because I am not informed, but in New England, the first settlers brought independence with them. Governor Winthrop, Jeremiah Dummer, Jonathan Mayhew might claim the honor with as good a color as Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, or Christopher Gadsden, or Roger Sherman." I think Adams makes an interesting point that the early immigrants to New England brought a tradition of independence and self-governance with them. And then Adams makes an effort to spread the credit evenly between early New Englanders and the Revolutionary War luminaries of both North and South. Madison replied, "Your remark is very just on the subject of independence. It was not the offspring of a particular man or a particular moment. If the merit of independence, as declared in 1776, is to be traced to individuals, it belongs to those who first meditated the glorious measure, who were ablest in contending for it, and who were the most decided in supporting it. Future times will be disposed to apportion this merit justly, and the present times ought to bequeath the means for doing it, unstained with the unworthy feelings you so properly deprecate. Madison being diplomatic, he left it to future times to award the credit for independence to specific individuals, but noted that the credit belonged to anyone who thought it through, who fought for it, and who supported it. Throughout the 1820s and 1830s, James Madison received many invitations to Independence Day celebrations. Everyone wanted him to be an honored guest at their events, but they failed to take into account that he was in his 70s or 80s and his health was gradually declining. In 1823, Madison received at least 2 invitations. When he RSVP'd to a committee from Albemarle County, Virginia, he noted, quote, "Notwithstanding the pleasure I should feel in meeting them on such an occasion, I am obliged to forego it by circumstances which have not permitted me to accept a like invitation from another quarter." So we don't know where that other invitation came from. 1826 was, of course, the 50th anniversary of American independence, and Madison had even more far-flung invitations to attend celebrations in Washington, D.C. and New York City. It was probably unrealistic of the event planners to expect the 75-year-old former president to attend, but the invitations were extended anyway. Madison declined both, and in his letters of regret, he expressed his feelings about this significant anniversary. He described the celebration in Washington as an event which calls forth so many rejoicing reflections on the past and anticipations of the future career of our country. And he concluded, "Ever honored will be the day which gave birth to a nation and to a system of self-government, making it a new epoch in the history of man." Due to a postal error, Madison did not even receive the New York invitation until July the 1st, meaning that he couldn't have attended, even if he felt up to it, and if he had not already declined the Washington event. He wrote back to the New Yorkers, "Had the present state of my health, therefore, which obliged me to decline a previous invitation to a like celebration less distant, not been a bar to the acceptance of yours, the above date," meaning the date of the reply, July 1st, "the above date will suggest an insuperable one. I beg the corporation to be assured of my sensibility to the flattering attention for which I am indebted, and of the great pleasure with which I should join my fellow citizens of New York in commemorating the day so dear to American patriotism and introducing an era so splendid in the progress of human society." July 4th, 1826 was also noteworthy for a great personal loss that Madison experienced: the death of his lifelong friend Thomas Jefferson, whom he had met 50 years earlier as members of the Virginia legislature in the fall of 1776. Dr. Dunlanson, a mutual friend, one of the first professors at the University of Virginia, had written Madison from Monticello on July 1st with a frank assessment of Jefferson's serious indisposition and the difficulty of making a recovery at his age, which was 83. Dr. Dunlanson still held out some hope, but warned that, quote, "Without some speedy amelioration, my worst apprehensions must soon be realized." It was 2 days after the fact that Madison learned of his friend's death by way of a note from Nicholas Trist. Trist was married to Jefferson's granddaughter and was a friend of Madison's as well. As soon as Madison received the news, he wrote back to Trist noting that, quote, "A few lines from Dr. Dunlanson had prepared me for such a communication." While Madison had hoped that Jefferson would be spared a few years longer, he wrote to Trist that Jefferson lives and will live in the memory and gratitude of the wise and good, as a luminary of science, as a votary of liberty, as a model of patriotism, and as a benefactor of humankind. In these characters I have known him, and not less in the virtues and charms of social life, for a period of 50 years, during which there was not an interruption or diminution of mutual confidence and cordial friendship, for a single moment in a single instance. And on the same day, Dolly Madison wrote about Jefferson's death to her son, John Payne Todd, noting that Mr. M feels his departure deeply. A few days later, Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, wrote to Madison that he was sending Dr. Dunlanson to Montpelier with a special memento. A cane, a legacy left you by my dear grandfather, as a token of that intimate friendship which had so long existed between you. A man's walking stick was a very personal accessory, in the same way that a woman's ring or brooch might be. Madison sent his heartfelt thanks to Randolph for the walking stick, writing that he had received it, quote, with all the feelings due to such a token of the place I held in the friendship of one whom I so much revered and loved when living, and whose memory can never cease to be dear to me. And as you may already know, Jefferson was not the only Revolutionary War luminary to die on the 50th anniversary of independence. John Adams also died on that auspicious date. Madison had never been as personally close to Adams, but his death undoubtedly made an impression as well. We don't know exactly when Madison learned of Adams' death, but his first mention of it is in a letter written to his cousin Hubbard Taylor on July 29th. The letter makes clear that the news of the near simultaneous deaths of the two former presidents was common knowledge by that point. Madison wrote, I need not touch on the singular occurrences which have distinguished the present epoch, and which have produced a display of universal feeling, so honorable to the nation which so honors its benefactors. We know that James Monroe visited Montpelier in late July 1826, and we can only imagine the conversations as Madison and Monroe reflected on the events of July 4th, and particularly the loss of their close friend Jefferson. They may have had the same thought that Lafayette shared with Madison later that summer. My dear friend, we are few remaining of those old revolutionary times. As I mentioned earlier, Madison received many invitations to July 4th events during his retirement, which he usually declined. In 1827, however, he accepted an invitation to a dinner in Orange Courthouse, as the town was then known. It was an invitation which he would come to regret accepting. 8 local gentlemen, including Madison's nephew Ambrose Madison, sent this invitation. Sir, the citizens of Orange County and its vicinity intend to celebrate the anniversary of American independence at the Orange Hotel, and most respectfully request your company on that occasion. As the newspaper reported, the anniversary of the 4th of July, 76, was celebrated at Orange Courthouse with great enthusiasm. The Declaration of Independence was read, accompanied by a few eloquent and appropriate remarks, after which an oration was delivered. About 70 or 80 gentlemen dined together. There were many guests invited, all the revolutionary soldiers, together with ex-President Madison. The newspaper reported that when the time came for after-dinner toasts, a toast was made to James Madison, and in response, quote, Mr. M arose, and after making his acknowledgments for the kind notice taken of him, which he was very sensible he owed more to their partiality than to any just claim he had to it, Mr. M said he would propose for commemoration a revolutionary worthy in whose favor too much could not be said. he had in view John Page, a former governor of Virginia, and one of the soundest Republicans and purest patriots that this or any country had produced. Of his titles to these characters, he had given the best proofs through the whole career of his political life, and especially by the great and peculiar sacrifices he made at the earliest day in the causes of independence, the birth of which we are celebrating. The other speeches given at the dinner, however, indicated to Madison that this was not just a patriotic celebration, but a partisan political event. As Madison explained to the organizer after the event, when I received the invitation of the anniversary celebration, my anticipation was that it would be of a national, not of a party character. A contrary supposition would necessarily have kept me away, notwithstanding the many valued friends among whom I was to find myself. The several distinguished individuals who now divide the public favor and feelings, having each of them possessed my respect and confidence. In other words, the retired president didn't want to be seen as taking sides in current politics, especially when he respected the opposing candidates. Since the organizers wanted to publish his remarks about John Page, Madison went so far as to request that a margin note be added to explain, quote, that I attended on invitation as a guest to celebrate the day without any knowledge of or participation in the proceedings. And when the toast was published, the newspaper obligingly put an asterisk next to Madison's name with an explanatory footnote. Perhaps not surprisingly, Madison politely declined the committee's invitation for the 1828 Independence Day dinner. Now, this next excerpt from Madison's writings comes from January 1828. But Madison's reflections on independence were not limited to July 4th anniversaries. The rising generation wanted to know his views no matter what the season. So here are some thoughts that Madison shared with his friend, the historian Jared Sparks. Sparks had asked Madison an intriguing question. Did Madison think that when the Revolutionary War first began, or when the First Continental Congress assembled, that the leaders of that time were already in favor of independence from England? And Madison replied, I readily express my entire belief that they were not, though I must admit that my means of information were more limited than may have been the case with others still living to answer the inquiry. My first entrance on public life was in May 1776, when I became a member of the convention in Virginia, which instructed her delegates in Congress to propose the Declaration of Independence. Previous to that date, I was not in sufficient communication with any under the denomination of leaders to learn their sentiments or views on that cardinal subject. It has always been my impression that a reestablishment of the colonial relations to the parent country prior to the controversy was the real object of every class of the people, till the despair of obtaining it and the exasperating effects of the war and the manner of conducting it prepared the minds of all for the event declared on the 4th of July, 1776, as preferable, with all its difficulties and perils, to the alternative of submission to a claim of power at once external, unlimited, irresponsible, and under every temptation to abuse from interest, ambition, and revenge. So that's a really interesting insight from Madison, something we don't always remember, that many colonists wanted to reconcile with Great Britain until it became a question of submitting to the unchecked and abusive power claimed by the king. In 1831, the ever-optimistic committee members once again invited James Madison to attend their July 4th event at Orange Courthouse, noting that the anniversary of American independence had, quote, become particularly more interesting now, whilst conflicting opinions upon certain great political questions threaten seriously to disturb that harmony amongst the states, so essential to the prosperity of our national Confederacy. If Madison's health wouldn't permit attending in person, the committee suggested that perhaps he could send a sentiment to be read at the dinner. And in his reply, Madison expressed the respect we feel for that great anniversary, but offered his feeble state of health as an excuse for declining. He took the committee up on their alternative suggestion and sent this statement to be read at the dinner. May the political discords in our country, so grateful to the enemies, be speedily brought to a conclusion that will inspire fresh confidence in the friends of our free institutions. As Lafayette had said 5 years earlier with the deaths of Adams and Jefferson, there were few remaining of those old revolutionary times. And on July 4th, 1831, another member of the Revolutionary Band passed away, Madison's good friend, James Monroe. Madison and Monroe had last seen each other at the Virginia State Constitutional Convention in 1829, which Monroe had to leave early due to his health. They hoped to see each other in July 1830 at a UVA Board of Visitors meeting, but Monroe's health prevented him from traveling. In December 1830, Monroe wrote to Madison that he had gone to New York to be with his daughter's family, and he hoped the change of scenery would be restorative. In April 1831, Monroe accepted that the move to New York was permanent for health and financial reasons, and he wrote Madison, "I deeply regret that there is no prospect of our ever meeting again. Since so long have we been connected and in the most friendly intercourse in public and private life, that a final separation is among the most distressing incidents that will occur." Madison replied feelingly, "The effect of this in closing the prospect of our ever meeting again afflicts me deeply, certainly not less so than it can you. The pain I feel at the idea, associated as it is with a recollection of the long, close, and uninterrupted friendship which united us, amounts to a pang which I cannot well express." Alexander Hamilton Jr. wrote to Madison from New York on June 30th that the newspapers were already reporting Monroe's dangerous indisposition, and added, "I have the melancholy task of informing you that his death is inevitable and will most probably take place before this reaches you." On July 4th, mutual friend Tench Ringgold wrote that Monroe had passed, adding, "What a remarkable coincidence of the deaths of 3 of our venerable revolutionary patriots and presidents." In a follow-up letter a few days later, Ringgold told Madison, "During his illness, he often mentioned you to me and expressed not only his most affectionate regard, respect, and esteem for you, which it gave him pleasure to say had never for 40 years been for one moment interrupted, but his great regret that he should leave this world without having the happiness of once more beholding you, his oldest and most valued friend." Madison received the news by July 9th, when he thanked Monroe's doctor for writing to him and commented again on the significance of the date. The time of it was so far happy, as it added to another of the coincidences before so remarkable and so memorable. So not happy in a joyful sense, but a happy coincidence. To Ringgold, he wrote a more personal reflection on Monroe's character, principles, and service to his country, as well as his own friendship with Monroe. A close friendship, continued through so long a period and such diversified scenes, had grown into an affection very imperfectly expressed by that term, and I value accordingly the manifestation in his last hours that the reciprocity never abated. 5 years later, it was Madison who had departed, and his friends who were in mourning. James Madison died on June 28, 1836, at the age of 85. One of the doctors who attended him in his last illness was his old friend, Dr. Dunlanson, the one who had prepared him for the news of Jefferson's death 10 years earlier. Paul Jennings, Madison's enslaved body servant, wrote this description of Madison's end of life in his book, A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison. For 6 months before his death, he was unable to walk and spent most of his time reclined on a couch. But his mind was bright, and with his numerous visitors, he talked with as much animation and strength of voice as I ever heard him in his best days. I was present when he died. That morning, Suki brought him his breakfast as usual. He could not swallow. His niece, Mrs. Willis, said, "What is the matter, Uncle James?" "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." His head instantly dropped, and he ceased breathing as quietly as the snuff of a candle goes out. Dolly Madison's niece, Mary Cutts, wrote in her memoir, "When summoned to his last account, he lingered several days, and the physicians would have prolonged his life until the 4th of July. But he would not be unnecessarily stimulated, and died in the full possession of all his noble faculties, the 28th of June, 1836, in the 86th year of his age, and being the anniversary of the forming of the Constitution by himself." Now, we've already seen how Madison and his contemporaries noted the auspicious passing of Jefferson and Adams on the 50th anniversary of American independence, and Monroe on the 55th. What would it have meant for Madison to depart on the 60th anniversary? Perhaps Madison was not interested in making a portentous exit. Perhaps he was doubtful that stimulant medication would be effective. Or maybe he was just exhausted and weak after months of decline. It's interesting that Mary Cutts tried to connect his death date to a constitutional anniversary. She wanted her uncle to have some of the patriotic glory that went with a well-timed death, even if she had to adapt the chronology to fit the facts. June the 28th was within the time frame of the Constitutional Convention, but not an exceptionally memorable day. The delegates were getting nowhere as they wrangled over equal versus proportional representation, and Ben Franklin couldn't even get a motion voted on to begin each day's session with a prayer. Despite passing on his own timetable, James Madison did leave us with a final message. He had written a short statement a few years earlier, which he intended to be read after his death. As this advice, if it ever see the light, will not do it till I am no more, it may be considered as issuing from the tomb, where truth alone can be respected, and the happiness of man alone consulted. It will be entitled, therefore, to whatever weight can be derived from good intentions, and from the experience of one who has served his country in various stations through a period of 40 years, who espoused in his youth and adhered through his life to the cause of liberty, and who has borne a part in most of the great transactions which will constitute epochs of its destiny. The advice nearest my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of states be cherished and perpetuated. Let the open enemy to it be regarded as a Pandora with her box opened, and the disguised one as the serpent creeping with his deadly wiles into paradise. And that, if you ask me, is as glorious a conclusion for a 4th of July presentation as we can hope to have. Now maybe we can take a few questions.